After narrowly escaping from the Center for Disease Control, Rick Grimes and the rest of the group decide to leave Atlanta for good. The city is firmly in the hands of the walkers, and they decide to give Shane's idea of finding refuge at the army base at Fort Benning a try. Before leaving, Rick attempts to contact Morgan Jones one last time about the city. He urges him to stay away for his and his son's safety. As the group prepares for their journey, Shane Walsh stares longingly at Rick's family. The group abandons some of the vehicles in their convoy, bringing just the RV, Carol Pelletier's Cherokee, and Merle Dixon's motorcycle, now driven by his brother Daryl. Andrea watches curiously as Shane takes apart his gun to clean it with ease. As he begins to show Andrea how to clean her own gun, she explains that it was a gift from her father before she and Amy took off on their road trip so that they could protect themselves. The convoy then discovers the road is blocked by several abandoned vehicles. Upon finding a pathway through the vehicles, Glenn suggests they use the other highway they passed, but Dale states they can't spare wasting the fuel. The group nervously crawls through the wreckage, with no way to know what sort of dangers lurk within. The situation worsens when the RV's radiator hose breaks down again. This forces the group to stop. The group begin to salvage the abandoned vehicles in the hopes of finding a spare radiator hose to use. Shane warns the group to be careful as the highway is essentially a graveyard, so there is a possible chance that some of the vehicles will be occupied by walkers. Glenn helps Dale fix the radiator hose, while Rick takes watch with a rifle behind the RV, while Dale climbs to his post on the roof. Andrea heads back inside the RV to try to put together Shane's gun after half-heartedly searching through a few cars. Lori, Carol, Carl, and Sophia look through cars further up the highway. Carol finds and holds up some clean clothes to her chest and smiles to herself. T-Dog and Daryl work together to siphon fuel. Shane finds a delivery van with several canisters of fresh water still inside. Glenn takes notice of this and hollers joyfully. Rick spots an approaching walker, but before he can shoot it, he notices a larger herd of walkers following behind it. He warns the group to hide under the vehicles and wait for the horde to pass. Dale lies flat on the roof of the RV as a mass of walkers passes through the wreckage. Shane spots the horde and grabs Glenn, throwing them both beneath a nearby truck. Andrea, unbeknownst of the horde of walkers passing through, is in the RV trying, but failing to put the gun back together. She finally sees the movement of walkers outside the RV. Stunned by the walkers outside the window, she cowers to the floor. As T-Dog attempts to hide, he accidentally slices his arm open on a broken window frame, resulting in him losing a large amount of blood. He is noticed by several walkers. Underneath the car further up the highway, Rick is calmly keeping Carl, Sophia, Lori, and Carol in his sights as the herd passes. Andrea grabs the pieces of Shane's gun and scrambles into the bathroom of the RV when a stray walker wanders through the open RV door. Andrea attempts to quietly assemble her gun. The walker turns back and is about to exit the RV when a piece of the gun in the bathroom clatters to the floor, making a loud noise. The noise alerts the walker to Andrea's location. She presses her feet to the door while the walker continues to press in violently. Dale notices Andrea's predicament through a screen on the roof. He throws down a screwdriver for her to use through the screen. Andrea then opens the door and repeatedly stabs the walker in the head with the screwdriver. T-Dog, delirious from blood loss, is almost grabbed by the walkers until Daryl emerges from behind a vehicle and covers himself and T-Dog in a mound of dead bodies, hiding their scent from the walkers. As the herd finally passes, Sophia emerges from under the vehicle she was hiding under, but is quickly spotted by two walkers straggling behind the herd. They chase her into the forest. Rick runs after her as Carol tries to scream for Sophia, but is stopped by Lori to prevent her from attracting the herd. Rick grabs Sophia and they run from the two walkers. He tells her he's going to draw the walkers away. He tells her to run to the highway if he doesn't come back. He instructs Sophia to wait by the creek bed and then chases after the two walkers. Using a rock, he's able to kill the walkers, hand to hand one at a time. When he returns to the creek bed, Sophia has vanished. He brings back Daryl, an expert tracker, Shane, and Glenn to the creek bed to search for Sophia. Shane wonders if Sophia really understood Rick's direction. Rick assures she understood his direction. Daryl leads them on Sophia's trail. He states that she was headed back to the highway just fine before she veered off in another direction. While Rick and Daryl continued to search through the forest for Sophia, Shane and Glenn returned to the traffic snarl to try to keep peace in the group and occupy them with jobs at the abandoned vehicles. Getting the road cleared means they can turn the RV around once it's repaired and double back to the bypass Glenn flagged on the map, they explain, to get around the snarl now that they had fuel. As the group plans to leave the highway, Carol argues that they should all be looking for her daughter, and Lori assures her that they wouldn't leave her behind. Carl finds a collection of edged weapons and tools on the lap of a rotting corpse in a pickup truck, and he excitedly shows them to Shane, who dismisses him without thought while he works on a new car. Lori notices this and tells Shane not to take things out on Carl. Carl runs off to give the knives to Dale, and when Lori confronts Shane, he reveals that he's leaving. He's guilt-stricken over what happened in the rec room at the CDC, and he tells her he's going out on his own as soon as gets the chance. Daryl picks up Sophia's trail again and leads Rick through the forest. They kill a walker, and Rick examines its fur skin under the fingernails and in its teeth. He finds flesh and begins to cut him open, but Daryl, the more experienced hunter of the two, steps in. Daryl rips open the walker's stomach only to find that he's eaten a woodchuck. Andrea comforts Carol as Sophia hasn't returned to the highway and the sun is setting. After doing so, he asks Dale for her gun. Dale refuses to give the gun to Andrea out of fear for her safety, and Shane backs him up. Carol is grief-stricken that Sophia will be alone in the woods at night, but Daryl and Rick assure her that they will find Sophia in the morning. The next morning, Rick arms the group and Andrea, again, demands her gun back, only to have her request dismissed by the others out of fear she'll use it to kill herself. Andrea confronts Dale about her gun in front of the others and angrily tells him that he took away her only chance to die peacefully. She states that he robbed her of her choice by forcing her to save his life. The survivors leave Dale and T-Dog, whose arm has been bandaged, at the RV and head out to search the forest for Sophia. As the day wears on, the group is tired and worn from a long and fruitless search. They come upon a campsite where a man has committed suicide and has nothing of value except a gun. At the RV, Dale is taking watch with his binoculars, and T-Dog asks why he's not fixing the radiator hose so they can get out of there if or when the group comes back with Sophia. Dale states that he fixed the hose the day before, but that he's trying to keep the group united in the search for Sophia. The group is overjoyed when they hear the sounds of church bells in the woods. They have hope that Sophia is setting them off. They run towards the noise and find a small Baptist church, but Shane insists it's the wrong one because it doesn't have a steeple. They head inside anyway, Rick, Shane, and Daryl killing walkers, but they find no trace of Sophia. Shane continues insisting it's the wrong church when the bells ring again. They run outside and find the automated bell timer around the side of the building. Glenn unhooks the timer in frustration as Carol announces she's going back inside the church for a while. Carl, Rick, and Glenn join her inside, while Andrea takes a rest outside in the shade. She overhears Lori and Shane talking about his plans to leave and hears Lori tell Shane she thinks he's making the right choice to go. After Lori heads inside the church with the others, outside the church, Andrea asks Shane to take her with him when he leaves, pointing out that the two of them don't belong in the group. He rebuffs her, but she asks him to consider it. With daylight fading, the others decide to head back to the RV, but Rick isn't ready to give up the search for Sophia. Reluctantly, Shane agrees to stay behind. Carl, too, insists on staying with them, and Lori agrees to let him stay with his dad. Rick tries to give Lori his gun, but she won't leave him unarmed, so Daryl hands her the gun he grabbed off the man in the tent that afternoon. On their way back to the highway, Carol expresses frustration that their search turned up no new leads on Sophia, and Daryl, too, doesn't like that the group has been further split up. Andrea chooses the moment to verbally attack Lori for carrying a gun when she's been denied one for 2 days. Lori angrily gives Andrea a gun, and she tells her to stop blaming Rick for what happened to Sophia because no one else ran after her like he did. She tells them she's tired of them not trusting her family and that any of them are free to leave anytime they want. Feeling guilty, Andrea hands back the gun and the group continues back to the highway. Meanwhile, as Rick, Shane, and Carl search the woods, they come upon a buck stopped in a clearing. Shane raises his gun to shoot it, but Rick holds him back as a curious Carl slowly moves closer to the buck. Smiling, he turns back to Rick and Shane, who watch peacefully as the deer stands tall, staring back at Carl. Suddenly, a gunshot rings out. The deer falls to the floor, and so does Carl, who has been shot. Rick is running relentlessly through a field, Carl unresponsive in his arms. Shane follows behind with an overweight hunter, who's struggling to keep up. The man shot Carl, and Shane is abusing him for it. How far? Rick yells, turning back around for only a second, and the hunter breathlessly sends him ahead. Ask for Herschel. Tell him Modus sent you. Rick crosses a tree line and a farmhouse is visible. He quickens his desperate pace. A young woman with a brunette bob sees him running across the field through a pair of binoculars. "Dad," she shouts from the front porch. Rick stops when he reaches the front steps of the farmhouse, staring up at an old man surrounded by his family and begging, "Are you Herschel?" He explains that Herschel's man, Otis, shot his son, and Herschel immediately enlists the help of his daughter, Maggie, and another woman, Patricia, to help save Carl. Otis and Shane finally arrive at the farmhouse, and Otis is beside himself with guilt, while Shane rushes to comfort his stunned best friend, soaked in Carl's blood. Back inside the house, Herschel Green demands to know what happened. "I was tracking a buck," Otis sputters, seeking comfort in Patricia. "I didn't see him until he was on the ground." Herschel asks Carl's blood type and Rick says, "A positive." "Same as mine." But Herschel looks no less relieved when he replies, "That's fortunate. Don't wander far. I'm gonna need you." Herschel determines that the bullet broke into pieces in his abdomen and he would likely need to operate to get all of the pieces out. The dire reality of the situation causes Rick to come out of his trance and remember his wife, and he sobs into Shane's shoulder because she doesn't even know that her son's been shot. Meanwhile, as they trudge back to the highway, the others have heard the gunshot in the woods, and no one's more concerned than Lori. "Why was it just one gunshot?" she asks, knowing Rick and Shane wouldn't waste a bullet to take down a single walker. Carol Pelletier agrees that Rick and Shane should have caught up to the group by now, but Daryl Dixon, brandishing his crossbow, calms them down. Andrea offers support to Carol over her daughter Sophia's disappearance, and Carol admits she just keeps thinking she doesn't want her daughter to end up like Amy. She immediately backpedals, apologizing to Andrea about mentioning Amy, but Andrea's already lost, missing her sister all over again. Daryl steps in. "We're gonna find that little girl. She's gonna be just fine." They continue to walk back towards the highway. Dale asks T-Dog how he's feeling with the cut on his arm, now covered with a gauze bandage and some gaffer tape. T-Dog dodges the question, and Dale presses him. Lifting T-Dog's makeshift bandage, Dale notices that he's developing a blood infection. Lightheaded, T-Dog laughs off the old man. "Wouldn't that be the way? World's gone to hell. Dead people risen up to eat the living, and Ole Theodore Douglas gets done in by a cut on his arm." Dale insists that they need to start looking for antibiotics, stunned they've yet to find any with all the cars they have looked through. Tired, T-Dog grudgingly joins in, finding a pack of cigarettes in the glove compartment of a minivan. His eye catches something in the backseat, a blood-covered, empty baby's car seat. Unnerved and with a cigarette dangling from his mouth, he backs away from the vehicle. At the farm, Rick blames himself for what happened to his son as Herschel works to save the boy's life. Rick says, clearly understanding that it was the search for Sophia and saying he could join him and Shane that led to his son being shot. But Shane stands behind him, telling him not to blame himself for everything that happened with Sophia and Carl. He assures Rick that Carl will survive getting shot, just like he did. Maggie calls Rick in and tells him that Carl needs blood. Patricia, who acts as Herschel's nurse, sticks a needle in Rick's arm. Herschel goes into Carl's stomach and Carl screams in agony. Shane holds down Carl and Herschel pulls a bullet fragment out from his wound before Carl passes out from the pain. Herschel states that he has removed one of the fragments, but there are still 5 more that are buried too deep for him to get out without putting Carl under. If Carl moved and screamed like he did the first time when he went deeper, he'd sever an artery, Herschel explains. Rick insists that Lori has to know, but Shane stops him from leaving his son's side to search for her on his own because Carl needs more of Rick's blood. Shane tells him to have the strength of his wife, who kept a bedside vigil for Rick after he was shot months earlier. Herschel tells Rick that Carl will need major surgery to remove the last fragments, but that there was internal bleeding and that they are unequipped at the farm for such a process. He claims that they need a respirator and more equipment to undergo this operation without losing Carl. Herschel explains that these materials are all from the FEMA command post that's set up at the local high school 5 miles from the farm. "The place was overrun last time I saw it," says Otis. Shane's prepared to go on his own, and Rick is guilt-ridden for it, but Otis volunteers to go along to right his mistake. Patricia, his wife, tries to object, but he won't hear it. Maggie, Herschel's eldest daughter, offers to find Lori and the rest of the survivors to tell them what happened. Rick gives Otis his Colt as a secondary weapon before he leaves with Shane for the high school, thanking the man for risking his life to help save his son. Otis's only other gun is the rifle he shot Carl with, and he packs it into the truck sheepishly as he and Shane pile into his pickup truck. Back at the RV, T-Dog, now delirious, tries to convince Dale that the two of them should take the RV and run, believing that the group will be quick to kill them as he sees them as the two weak links. Dale blows him off, but he realizes that T-Dog's infection is getting worse due to an intense fever and continues looking for antibiotics after making T-Dog take some ibuprofen he found to knock the fever down. About 100 yards from the highway on their way back from searching for Sophia, Andrea is attacked by a walker. The group rushes back to help her, but the walker has her pinned to the ground. She's terrified, and she wonders if this is it. A horse gallops out of the bush and Maggie, baseball bat in hand, knocks the walker off Andrea before any damage is done. Maggie tells Lori that Carl was shot and tells her to get on the horse, giving the rest of the group directions to Green Farm. Glenn looks on dumbfounded. Daryl tries to object to her leaving with a stranger, but Lori, stunned by the news, doesn't question it. She jumps on the back of the horse and heads towards the farmhouse with Maggie. Rick admires Herschel's picturesque farm, which Herschel says has been in his family for 160 years. Herschel tries to reassure Rick that the virus is a temporary thing and that a cure will be found, but Rick tries to tell him it's a lot worse than he thinks. Maggie and Lori are seen galloping on the horse towards the house. Lori arrives at the house and breaks down when she sees Carl lying passed out in bed with gauze to cover his wound. After Rick gives his second blood transfusion, Herschel hands him a glass of orange juice and assures him and Lori that he'll have a far better chance of saving Carl if Shane and Otis get back from the high school with the proper equipment. He tells them that he's done the surgery before, but he informs them he's a veterinarian, not a doctor. Lori struggles to accept that this is the best care available for her son. Back at the highway, Andrea won't speak to Dale, who heard her screams in the forest. He's stunned to find out Carl's been shot, but he tells Glenn to take T-Dog to Herschel's farm for medical treatment on his arm, while the others stay behind to wait for Sophia. They decide to rig a sign for Sophia in the morning before they all move to the farm. Daryl, hearing how badly in need of antibiotics T-Dog is, gives him a selection of antibiotics from his brother Merle's stash of drugs, which he left behind at the campsite after cutting off his own hand in Atlanta and fleeing. Shane and Otis arrive at the high school at dusk. They discover that it is still overrun by walkers. They formulate a plan to cross the parking lot and get to the now abandoned FEMA trailer. Shane pops the trunk of an abandoned police cruiser and finds a set of flares. He sets them off, distracting the walkers and enabling them to reach the trailer unharmed. Herschel warns Rick and Lori that Carl's blood pressure keeps dropping and soon they'll have to decide whether or not to do the surgery without the anesthetic, which has a higher chance of killing him, but he also says that he will die without the surgery. Rick wants to go after Shane and Otis, but Lori commands him to stay for her and Carl's sake. After successfully collecting the necessary equipment from the trailer, Shane and Otis are quickly overrun. They lock themselves inside the school by placing a cotter pin in a sliding gate, which is being shaken loose by an overbearing herd trying to make its way inside. Rick and Lori wait patiently at Carl's bedside for Shane and Otis to return from the FEMA command post at the local high school so that Herschel Green can perform the surgery that will save their son's life. Rick, weak from multiple blood transfusions to keep Carl alive, tells Lori a familiar story about a prank Shane pulled on the principal when they were in high school. Focused on her son's health, Lori begs him to eat to keep his strength up, while Rick tries to convince her that Carl will be fine. In the RV, Carol is crying over Sophia's disappearance in the bedroom, keeping Daryl bitter, and Andrea is still trying to put together a gun, this time using Daryl's, and doing much better. He takes it back from her when he decides to go out looking for Sophia. With nothing else to do, Andrea decides to go with him. When Dale tries to object to them heading out in the middle of the night, Andrea shuts him down as she and Daryl head into the woods. Otis and Shane, still with a full head of hair, have made it into the high school's auditorium and onto the bleachers. They determine that they still can't outrun the walkers as there are too many. When Shane spots a window and suggests they try to jump through, Otis rejects the idea on account of his size. He instead tells Shane to go for the windows on his own. While he draws the walkers away to the locker rooms, he says that the windows there are larger and he can escape easily. Otis's plan works, and he's able to draw most of the walkers from the auditorium, growling and reaching for him as they go, while Shane shoots at the dead from atop the bleachers. Shane makes it to the window and is almost out, but a walker makes it up the bleachers, grabbing for him through the broken window frame. He grabs his gun and shoots the walker, but loses his grip on the window and falls 2 stories below and lands hard on his ankle. Glenn and T-Dog arrive at the farm and nervously discuss whether they're supposed to knock. They hadn't knocked on anyone's front door in months. But they're surprised by Maggie Green, sitting in a darkened corner on the porch, listening in on their conversation. "Close the gate up the road when you drove in?" she asks, and Glenn sputters a yes. Maggie smiles and invites them inside, where they find Rick and Lori at Carl's bedside with Herschel. Herschel states that Shane and Otis are taking too long to return and that Carl's condition is growing worse. He informs Rick and Lori that he may have to attempt the surgery without the equipment and that they're going to have to make a choice sooner rather than later. The two talk it over and Lori wonders if Carl might be better off dead, but Rick doesn't want to hear it. He asks her what's changed since the CDC, when Jenner offered them a way out. Remembering how Jackie committed suicide, Lori sobs, "Maybe this isn't a world for children anymore. We live with a knife at our throats every second of every day." She begs for him to give her a reason why it would be better to live. But Rick still decides to fight for his son as Shane fights for his life at the school. Limping, Shane shoots various walkers, but is about to be overrun when Otis saves him from the approaching walkers, though they both used their last rifle rounds. They start to limp away as the walkers tear at the fences. Carl wakes for a very brief moment and talks excitedly about the deer that he saw, but he then has a seizure. His blood pressure drops and Rick desperately offers to do another transfusion. Herschel doesn't want to take any more blood from him in case he goes into a coma or suffers cardiac arrest, but he begins to take out his kit anyway. It's the only way to keep Carl alive until Shane and Otis get back. While they search the dark forest, Daryl tells Andrea about the time he was lost in the woods when he was a child. As they discuss Sophia's chances, he's hopeful. She's not. They come upon a walker hanging from a tree. His feet have been chewed at by walkers. He had committed suicide and left a note, "Got bit. Fever hit. World gone to shit. Might as well quit." Daryl scoffs, "Dumbest didn't know enough to shoot himself in the head." Daryl wants to leave it alone and not waste an arrow, but Andrea, disgusted, asks him to kill it. Daryl kills the walker in exchange for asking Andrea if she wants to live yet. She says she doesn't know if she has to live, wants to live, or if it's just a habit. Unable to sleep, Carol joins Dale on the roof of the RV to help take watch. She can tell that Dale is worried about Andrea, and she tries to comfort him. But Dale leaves her alone on the roof, handing her a rifle she clearly doesn't know how to use. At the farmhouse, Patricia is busy stitching up T-Dog's arm, while Glenn is trying to pray for the safety of Carl before Maggie interrupts him on the front porch. He's never prayed before, and he and Maggie discuss if God exists. Before she goes back inside to leave him alone, she tells him, "Feel free to believe in God, but you gotta make it okay somehow, no matter what happens." As Carl sleeps, Rick returns to his conversation with Lori, having left it with her wondering if the world was worth living in anymore and needing Rick to tell her something to hold on to. He says that Carl's reminisces about how beautiful the deer was when he woke up told him that there was still a world out there for them. But the latest transfusion wasn't enough, and Rick's hope is able to convince Laurie to allow Herschel to do the surgery without the anesthetic. Patricia pulls the shade off a table lamp as Herschel sterilizes his equipment, and they place Carl on a metal tray. He's getting ready to start when the pickup pulls into the driveway, the headlights shining in through the window. When the group goes to investigate, they find that Shane has returned with the supplies, but without Otis. Shane seems stunned, quiet. He tells them they were overrun and claims that Otis sacrificed himself so that he could escape. Herschel demands that no one needs to tell Patricia until after the surgery, and Maggie sobs as Rick embraces Shane for bringing back the equipment and comforts him, saying that Otis wanted to make it right. Daryl and Andrea return safely to the RV without Sophia. Carol sees and returns tearfully to bed, and Dale stops Andrea before she heads in for the night. He apologizes for making choices for her and gives back her gun, adding, "I can still ask. Please don't make me regret this." "I'll take watch," Andrea tells him, and he asks if she forgives him. She stops before she climbs up the ladder onto the RV and says, "I'm trying." Glenn comforts Maggie over the loss of Otis, and she tells him about her stepmother and stepbrother, who both became walkers. Herschel is able to stabilize Carl, which leaves Rick and Laurie near tears. Rick offers to help Herschel with informing Patricia about Otis. As she sobs, Shane looks on from the living room. Shane goes to Carl's room, where he finds Laurie at his bedside and stands back nervously. "Stay," she says to him, but he can't. Shane goes to the bathroom and has his shower, and with his full head of hair he finds a bald spot where it looks as if hair has been pulled from his scalp. He remembers what happened at the high school as he looks around the bathroom and various drawers and cabinets for an electric razor. In a flashback we see Otis pull Shane along after he collapses from his ankle injury. They shoot at various walkers and manage to get to the parking lot, a herd of walkers behind them. They are both down to their last round of ammunition. Shane tells Otis to leave him and take the supplies, but Otis refuses to leave him and pulls him up, helping him. Shane hobbles as the walkers descend on them. With no other option of survival, he looks at Otis. "I'm sorry," he says, and Otis looks at him, confused, as Shane shoots him in the leg with his last bullet. Otis screams in pain, falling. Shane grabs for Otis's backpack with the supplies Carl needs inside, but Otis fights him, grabbing at a chunk of his hair and punching him. Shane is eventually able to overpower him, take his gun, and leave him as bait for the walkers. The walkers descend on Otis, devouring him while Shane is able to hobble away unnoticed. Back inside the Greens' bathroom, Shane shaves his head to hide the bald spot and protect his secret. Cattle are grazing at the farm as Daryl, Andrea, Dale, and Carol arrive with the RV and the rest of their belongings while Shane, T-Dog and Glenn help Herschel's family collect rocks for Otis's funeral. Rick and Laurie sit at their son Carl's bedside while he recovers from surgery that he had in the previous episode to remove bullet fragments from his abdomen. He wakes up briefly and asks whether Sophia is alright. Not wanting to cause further distress to Carl, Rick tells him that Sophia is fine. After everyone has settled, Herschel leads a funeral for Otis, piling his grave with the rocks they'd collected earlier, and asks Shane, wearing a pair of Otis's overalls, to offer some form of eulogy, since he was the last one to see him alive. Knowing the truth behind Otis's death, Shane initially tries to avoid having to make such a speech, but Patricia, Otis's wife, begs to know that his death had meaning, pointing out that Shane was the only one who shared Otis's final moments. Shane starts his eulogy, stating that Otis sacrificed his life to help save Carl. After the funeral, Herschel's eldest daughter, Maggie, brings a map of the county to assist in coordinating the search for Sophia, but Herschel won't allow Rick and Shane to head off the farm on account of Shane's ankle, and Rick having given 3 units of blood for Carl the day before. Daryl decides he'll head out to look for Sophia on his own. Shane suggests finally teaching people how to shoot, though Herschel disapproves of guns being carried around on his property. Rick agrees with Herschel, recognizing that he and the others are guests of Herschel and his family and must respect their rules. Shane reluctantly hands over his gun, and Andrea begrudgingly follows after him. Nonetheless, Rick is able to negotiate that Dale continues to serve as a lookout, keeping an eye out for nearby walkers. The group agrees amongst themselves that if they find Sophia and she's been bitten, that they'll do what needs to be done. Maggie states that medical supplies are running low, and she volunteers to take a trip to the local pharmacy a mile down the road to gather more. Rick suggests that Glenn accompany her, describing him as the group's go-to-town expert. Shane finds Lori by the RV and they have a brief and slightly awkward conversation about Carl's health. He settles into clean guns at a picnic table, and Andrea joins him, eager to learn once and for all. After Maggie informs Glenn of their upcoming trip to town, Dale asks her about water wells on the farm. Maggie explains that the second well was used for the cattle, but the water is just as pure as the well used for the house. She tells Dale and T-Dog to take what they need. She excuses herself to saddle the horses for the trip into town, much to Glenn's surprise. Rick tries to tell Daryl he doesn't need to head out on his own, and they can wait until the whole group is ready to go tomorrow. As Daryl heads into the woods, Herschel joins Rick outside. When Rick offers to set up his group's campsite by the barn to give the Green family more privacy, Herschel says that they're better off closer to the house. He tells Rick that he doesn't want his group to think they're welcome on the farm permanently. "Once you find this girl and your boys fit for travel, I expect you'll move on. We need to be clear on that," he tells him. As Glenn stares at Maggie in control of the two horses as they prepare to head into town, Lori pulls him aside and gives him a piece of paper with a list of supplies she needs him to get for her. In addition, Lori hands him a second piece of paper and asks him to obtain a special item for her from the feminine hygiene section of the pharmacy. Meanwhile, T-Dog and Dale walk out to one of the wells to get water for the group. Dale then notices a hole in the planks covering the nearby well shaft, and he moves closer to investigate. His face falls as the sound of lapping water is mixed in with the familiar growls of a walker. He stares at T-Dog, and just as he is about to take a drink of the water from the well, Dale knocks the ladle of water to the ground and warns him not to drink it. T-Dog looks at him confused. As Glenn, Maggie, Andrea, Lori, and Shane gather around the well, a bloated, wet zombie reaches helplessly for them from the bottom. Rick and Herschel survey a map over a picturesque lookout on his farm and take a break from discussing how to search for Sophia. They talk, and it eventually turns to God. Rick admits he's mostly faithless, and Herschel tries to assure him that God had a hand in him waking up from his coma, finding his family in the chaos, and for Carl surviving being shot. "Tells me God's got a strange sense of humor," Rick replies. The group discusses options to deal with the walker in the well, agreeing that shooting the walker in its place would certainly pollute the drinking water. They all agree that they need to coax the walker out of the well. The group attempts to bait it with canned ham. When it fails, they realize that it will obviously not eat anything that's not fresh. Realizing that nothing short of live bait will suffice, they decide to send Glenn down the well. They plan to have him fasten a rope around the walker so that it can be pulled out, alive and without contaminating the water, before they kill it. Maggie hates the idea, but knows it's the only plan they can think of to get the walker out alive and keep the well's water clean. She stands watch as the group slowly lowers Glenn down the well, using the water pump to provide anchorage for the rope. Glenn almost succeeds in getting the creature harnessed without it noticing him or the ropes, but the water pump breaks under Glenn's weight. This causes him to fall within reach of the now alert and frantic walker. Glenn screams at the group to pull him out. Eventually, they are able to pull a shaken and horrified Glenn back up. Catching his breath, while the group views the attempt as a failure, Glenn smiles, revealing that he was able to secure the rope around the walker amidst the chaos. Daryl finds an abandoned home in the woods, taking note that a can of sardines had recently been consumed. He also finds a makeshift bed inside a closet, only big enough for someone short, like Sophia. He calls her name as he walks outside, but he stops in front of a pair of white flowers in the grass. Back at the farm, the group is pulling the walker to the top of the well, but in its water-bloated state, it gets stuck on the sides of the well. As they pull harder, the walker splits in half, with the bottom part of its body and most of its entrails falling back into the well. Clearly disappointed at the wasted effort, T-Dog lets out his frustration, destroying the walker's brain with a pickaxe. The group decides to seal the well. Shane and Andrea head to the highway to comfort Carol, who has been waiting all day by a painted sign on a car windshield with a collection of food supplies for Sophia. Carol is losing hope that Sophia will be found alive and doesn't want to hear any comforting words. She tearfully leaves the highway with Andrea and Shane, who are looking at a potential place where they can have target practice. Shane, limping heavily because of his ankle injury, describes to Andrea how you just have to trust your instincts when it comes to protecting your life with a gun, describing without using names how he had to leave Otis to die for the greater good. Glenn is trying awkwardly to initiate a conversation with Maggie as they ride on the horses into town. She's quiet, having never seen a walker killed up close before because she's always been protected at the farm. After reaching the local pharmacy, Glenn hands her the master list Lori gave him and says he's just going to look around and see what's worth grabbing. As Maggie walks away to search, he pulls Lori's special list from his pocket. Finding the feminine hygiene section, he shuffles through a few random boxes on the floor, finding a true blue pregnancy test. As he reads the box and realizes why Lori needs it, his face falls. Maggie finds him, and he quickly stuffs the pregnancy test in his bag before she can see it. Maggie questions why he is in this section of the store and Glenn grabs a random box from the floor to cover his tracks. He's grabbed a box of condoms, and Maggie asks if he's got a girlfriend she doesn't know about or if he's just a confident guy. He sputters that he's neither, and he doesn't know how to get himself out of this mess. It's Maggie who gives him an out. "I'll have sex with you," she says to him. "It's not like our options are vast these days." She pulls off her shirt and bra and kisses Glenn, who follows her lead, dumbfounded and shocked. They proceed to have sex. Rick asks Herschel to reconsider sending the group off his farm once Carl has recovered and Sophie has been found. Herschel is reluctant to let him, but says he'll consider it if his group respects his rules. Rick tells Herschel that he regrets lying to his son about Sophia that morning when he asked if she was alright. He assures Rick that he believes he is a good father to Carl. Rick finds Lori in Carl's room, and she tells him that he was awake earlier and asked for him before she leaves the room. He looks peacefully upon the son he loves, a sense of calm in him, knowing that he'll be alright. As they make their way back to the farm, Maggie refers to their hookup as a one-time deal, which immediately disappoints Glenn. When they arrive back at the farm, Herschel right away seems to sense that something went on between them, giving his daughter a quizzical look when she returns and tells him quickly nothing happened. Lori greets Glenn by the RV, and he hands her the pregnancy test, which she quickly hides in the waistband of her jeans. He wants to say something, but he can't even look her in the eye as he walks away without a word. Inside the RV, Daryl has returned with no new leads on Sophia, but he does return with a flower like the one he found outside the house inside a beer bottle, the closest thing he could find to a vase. He gives it to Carol, who is busy cleaning out the RV to distract herself, claiming she wants it to look nice when Sophia gets back. Daryl proceeds to tell her the story of the Cherokee rose, the flower in his vase, said to bloom as a symbol of hope from the tears of the Cherokee mothers who lost their children to disease and starvation along the Trail of Tears after the white men had drove all the Indians off their lands. "I'm not fool enough to believe there's any flowers blooming for my brother, but I believe this one bloomed for your little girl." Rick is still at Carl's bedside when he wakes up that evening. He immediately apologizes for lying to his son about Sophia. He starts to explain why he did it, but Carl forgives him easily and tells him that his mother had already told him the truth. Carl makes light of how both he and his father have both been shot. Rick is amused by this, and he gives his sheriff hat to Carl to symbolize their shared experience. They exchange I love yous and Carl soon goes back to sleep. Having given up his hat, Rick continues to deconstruct from the lawful man of his existence pre-apocalypse, taking off his uniform and putting away his badge in a drawer at Herschel's home. Lori comes in as he is doing so and looks at his gunshot scar. She heads out of the house with a knife in hand, walking past the RV unnoticed while Dale, Carol, and Andrea are eating dinner inside. Finding a secluded place out in the fields on the farm, she pulls the pregnancy test from the back of her jeans. Peeing on the stick and then waiting, she bursts into devastated tears when she sees the plus sign, now knowing for sure that she is pregnant. At the farm, Lori wakes up late inside her tent, instantly feeling guilty about it. Carol has already started the chores and suggests she must have needed the sleep, but Lori says nothing when Carol asks if she's feeling alright. Carol asks Lori if she'd help her prepare the evening meal for Herschel and his family to thank them for taking in the survivors. Meanwhile, Rick is preparing the search grid with Shane, Daryl Dixon, Andrea, and T-Dog. Teenage Jimmy, the boyfriend of Herschel's youngest daughter Beth, offers to search with them because he says he knows the area well. But he doesn't have a gun, and Shane says he'll be useless until he joins the group for gun training, so Andrea offers for him to go with her and T-Dog. Daryl plans to set out on horseback alone to look for Sophia, believing he can spot her better from the ridge. Glenn and Maggie discuss what happened at the pharmacy. Maggie admits that she's not even sure that she likes him. While they search the woods for Sophia, Rick and Shane discuss Shane's conquests in high school. When Shane adds that nostalgia is dangerous because it keeps people from knowing when to move on, Rick knows him well enough to know that he's talking about the search for Sophia. Shane challenges Rick about his decisions to always try to help others when they should be focused purely on survival. He reminds Rick that everything they know about missing children from their time on the force has told them that they're looking for a body after 72 hours, and that was before the dead came back to life. Daryl is riding one of Herschel's horses through the woods when he spots something by the water. He parks the horse and climbs down, finding Sophia's doll, tattered and wet, against a log. He calls Sophia's name, to no avail. Taking the doll with him, he gets back on the horse and continues through the woods, but the horse is spooked by a snake in the grass and throws Daryl before it runs off. Out of control, he tumbles down the tree-covered ridge, landing hard in the shallow rocky water, with one of the arrows, which had been slung around his back, pierced through his torso. He rips off his shirt sleeves to keep the arrow in place before he uses a stick to find his crossbow in the chest-deep murky water. He climbs back up the steep ridge, using the stick and pushing himself up in his weakened state. He tries to will himself up the ridge but loses his grip and tumbles backwards toward the pond. At the farm, Glenn corners Lori at the tents and confirms she's pregnant. She begs him not to tell anyone. Glenn is stunned that she hasn't told Rick yet, but he disappears as Rick and Shane return from the woods without Sophia. Taking one look at them, she knows that something's wrong. Rick tells Lori that Shane wants to call off the search and that he thinks Rick's good intentions are making the group weaker. But Lori assures him that if it was Carl, she would want to know either way, insisting that there's nothing soft about the choices he has to make in their new world. Beth interrupts them to tell Rick that her father, Herschel, wants to speak with him. Rick finds Herschel by the generator and he informs Rick that Daryl took one of his horses, Nervous Nellie, without consent, and Rick informs him that he took Jimmy at his word when he said that Herschel was fine with him going out into the woods that day, but Herschel hadn't consented to that either. Rick concedes that they need to work on their communication, and Herschel requests he keep it simple. "I'll control my people, you control yours." Bloody and bruised, Daryl wakes up at the bottom of the ridge, and his brother, Merle Dixon, looms over him, telling him he's wasting his time looking for a little girl, but not looking for his brother. Daryl tells Merle that he and Rick went back to Atlanta for him, but he was gone, and Merle can't believe he's talking about the same Rick who made him cut off his own hand. In his groggy state, Daryl notices that Merle's right hand, which was last seen inside Glenn's backpack, is firmly attached to Merle's right arm, confirming to Daryl that this is, in fact, a hallucination. Merle assures Daryl that no one in Rick's group will ever care for him like he does. They're not his blood. "You go back there and shoot your pal Rick in the face for me," he tells him, yelling at him to get up and threatening to otherwise kick his teeth in. But Merle isn't kicking Daryl, and his hallucination melts away to reveal a walker grabbing at his feet, and his head clears just in time to kick the walker off him, finding his stick and bashing the walker over the head. A second walker emerges from the brush, and Daryl manages to remove his one remaining arrow from his wounded torso and load his crossbow just before the walker descends on him. He leaves the ridge agreeing with everything his brother said in his hallucination. He cuts off the ears of the dead walkers and makes them into a necklace before resuming his climb, only to be taunted by Merle again as he closes in on the top of the ridge. The taunts help Daryl to make it to the top, having pushed him forward and fed his anger. When Merle tells him that he was the only one who looked after his worthless ass. Daryl spits back, "You talk a big game, but you was never there. You ain't here now." Daryl makes it to the top of the ridge, his vision of Merle disappearing. Lori, Carol, Beth, and Patricia work to cook dinner in the farmhouse kitchen. Carol says she never thought she'd be so happy to see a potato peeler, while Lori notes she's just thrilled not to be roasting squirrels over a fire again tonight. But their presence in the kitchen irritates Herschel. He tells Maggie, who's setting the table, that he thinks they need to set clear boundaries with Rick's people, and she says she doesn't understand why it's a problem. "It's just dinner," she shrugs. Disconcerted, he asks about the Asian boy. She tells him Glenn's a friend, and he asks her not to make him chase her around like he does with Beth and Jimmy. She replies that she's not 16, and he doesn't need to chase her around. He tells her not to get close to him, reminding her that the survivors won't be around forever. Andrea's taking perch above the RV, brandishing a rifle and watching over the farm. "I don't want to wash clothes anymore, Dale." Dale heads inside the RV, where he finds Glenn returning one of his books. Glenn asks if Dale thinks Andrea's on her period, as Dale tries to make him keep his voice down. Glenn tells him that all the women are acting weird around camp, and that he read somewhere once that when women spend a lot of time together, their cycles line up. When Dale asks about Lori, Glenn backtracks, but opens up to Dale that he and Maggie had sex, but now she doesn't even want to talk to him. Dale gives him a hard time for not thinking it through, because Maggie's father is their host, but Glenn says he did it because he thought he could be dead tomorrow, and Dale backs off. But a disappointed Glenn leaves the RV, and Andrea spots a lone walker emerging from the woods. She peers through a pair of binoculars, the sun's reflection beaming off the glass, and announces, "I bet I can nail him from here." Rick orders her to put the gun down, and Shane tells Andrea, "You best let us handle this." Rick tells the group that Herschel wants to deal with walkers on his land, but Shane, T-Dog, and Glenn grab weapons and run towards the woods. Rick follows, brandishing his gun, but when the men come upon the supposed walker, they realize that it's Daryl, covered in dirt and blood. Dale begs Andrea not to shoot, but she tells him tersely to back off. Staring down the men, Daryl spits at Rick, "That's the third time you pointed that thing at my head. You gonna pull the trigger, or what?" Rick lowers his gun, but Andrea takes her shot from the top of the RV, hitting Daryl in the head. Rick screams in horror and Andrea's face falls. Lori, Carol, and Herschel's family run screaming from the farmhouse, and the sound of the gunshot, demanding to know what's going on. "I was kidding," Daryl mutters before he passes out after the shot, the bullet having grazed his temple. Dale and Andrea run towards the men in the field, and Andrea's pleading that Daryl's not dead. Rick and Shane carry Daryl back towards the house, and Glenn points out that Daryl's wearing ears. Rick stuffs the necklace in his pocket and tells the group to keep that to themselves. T-Dog finds Sophia's doll among Daryl's things, and the group looks on. Rick doesn't know for sure if this is a sign of hope or rejection. Inside the farmhouse, Rick questions Daryl about the doll, while Herschel tends to his wounds and comments that he never thought they would go through the antibiotics so quickly. He's still annoyed that Daryl took his horse, which is now missing. She must have dropped it crossing the creek somewhere, Daryl reasons, cutting their search grid in half and giving Rick hope. Shane, though, thinks that the doll is no sign that Sophie is still alive, but Rick doesn't want to hear it. Lori hears them, and when Rick walks off, Shane defends himself to her. "I'm not out to be a hard case. Just being realistic." Lori says she may not agree with all of Rick's choices, but she respects his choices more than she does either of theirs. Shane says that all he cares about now are her and Carl, so he doesn't care if he's not thinking about the needs of others, even if it means abandoning a lost child. Disgusted, Lori stalks off after telling him, "My son and I are not your problem anymore." Andrea's despondent on the front porch steps, and Dale comes to sit with her. That evening as Carl sleeps, recovering from his injuries, Lori sits alone at his bedside, tearfully wondering what she's going to do about her pregnancy. Carol enters the room to tell her dinner is ready, not at all surprised to find her crying in the world they live in. Lori wipes away her tears and heads down for dinner. The two groups sit down to a silent, awkward dinner, and Glenn tries to cut the tension asking if anyone knows how to play guitar because of the one Dale found at the traffic snarl. "Otis did," Patricia says softly, and the silence drones on. Glenn is sitting at the kids' table with Beth, Jimmy, and Maggie passes him a note under the table. "Tonight where," it reads, and he looks up, smiling at her. He excitedly scrawls something on the paper, which can be heard throughout the dining room as no one says a word to one another. Herschel and Dale look on disapprovingly. Carol brings a plate of food up to Daryl and thanks him for what he did looking for Sophia, kissing his bandaged head. Daryl rebuffs her, telling her to watch out for his stitches and turning to face the window. "You did more for my little girl today than her own daddy ever did for her in his whole life," she says, and he shrugs it off, saying he didn't do anything Rick or Shane wouldn't have done. "I know," Carol says. "You're every bit as good as them." Beth and Maggie are cleaning dishes after dinner, and Maggie sneaks away to read Glenn's note. "Ever done it in a haylift?" it says, and Maggie's eyes go wide. Glenn is at the barn with a flashlight and a sleeping bag, finding the barn door chained and padlocked. He walks around the barn and finds a ladder into the haylift, while Maggie runs desperately towards the barn. Once inside the barn, Glenn catches a whiff of a rancid smell and shines his flashlight towards the barn floor when he hears the familiar growls. There are dozens of walkers below, reaching up for him hungrily. He runs fearfully for the door and right into Maggie, who says regretfully, "You weren't supposed to see this." The morning after the discovery of the secret of the farm, the Atlanta survivors are busily doing chores around the farm. Finally back on his feet, Carl and Laura talk about the chickens they are feeding. Patricia cripples live chickens to feed the walkers that the family keep in the barn. Meanwhile, Glenn is watching the barn, with Maggie begging him to keep their secret. Glenn walks away to give food to Dale and T-Dog. Andrea visits Daryl to apologize by giving him a book, and he quickly tells her that they are fine because she was only trying to protect the group. Glenn confronts Lori about her pregnancy and whether she has told Rick about it yet, offering to go to town to get supplies for her. Jimmy, Rick, and Shane busily plan their search for Sophia, agreeing to search a nearby abandoned housing development after gun practice. Beth Green and Patricia both ask to be trained as Otis was the only member of the farm trained, though Rick will only do so if Herschel agrees. Carl also asks Shane to teach him, and it is discovered that he has taken a gun from Dale's RV. This leads to a heated conversation between Lori and Rick where Carl argues that he only wants to help. Lori agrees to allow Carl to learn how to handle the weapon. Glenn is asked if he wants to learn, but he excuses himself by saying he's going to be helping Dale. Unbeknownst to Glenn, Dale was nearby and overheard. He kept up the ruse and confronted Glenn after the others had left, leading Glenn to reveal the secrets of both Lori and Herschel. At the firing range, Andrea is proving to be a natural at handling a firearm. She asks Shane what made him decide to stay with the camp, but he doesn't answer and only stares at Carl and Lori with Rick. Back at the farm, Dale speaks with Herschel and brings up the walkers. Herschel argues that the walkers are still people and that everyone that is killed is, in the end, murder. Dale tries to make Herschel realize the truth about the walkers, but he will not accept the reality of the apocalypse. Dale offers to help reinforce the barn, but Herschel rebuffs him and asks him to keep the secret of the barn to himself if he truly wants to help. As Lori and Herschel repair a fence, she thanks him again for everything he has done and tells him that they will earn their place at the farm. Herschel again reminds her that he expects them to move on to Fort Benning soon. Andrea and Shane are trying advanced target training, using a swinging log as a mobile target. Trying to raise her anger to improve her focus, he badgers her by bringing up her sister Amy. Andrea walks away. Lori confronts Rick about Herschel's desire for them to leave and why he hasn't told anyone else in the group. Rick tells her that they have to give Herschel space if he's going to change his mind. Nonetheless, Rick reminds her if they have to leave, his first priority is her and Carl. Shane follows Andrea in his car after she storms away, but she wants nothing to do with him. Shane uses Sophia to get her to respond to him by telling her about the housing project. She agrees to search it with him. Back at camp, Dale tells Lori about his wife's miscarriage and admits that Glenn told him about her pregnancy. She tells him about Shane, but she's sure that the baby belongs to Rick. Dale assures her that the baby can have good memories, but he sits in silence when Lori asks if he thinks her child could live a long life. Glenn apologizes to Lori while chopping firewood, but Lori tells him not to worry about it. She asks him to go to town to get supplies and Maggie goes with him. The two argue over the nature of walkers and Maggie tells him that her father is angry at her for letting him find out. She tells him that they're still people and tells him not to call them walkers anymore, reciting their names to him. They return to the pharmacy where Maggie is attacked and only escapes after Glenn kills the walker. As this is happening, Andrea and Shane explore the housing community, hoping to find Sophia. They decide to search house by house. Maggie blows up on Lori for risking their lives and then argues with Glenn over his being little more than the errand boy for the Atlanta survivors when he could be a leader. While searching a home in the housing community, Andrea and Shane are swarmed by walkers. Shane uses this as an opportunity to test Andrea's shooting ability and handling of stress, especially after her gun jams in the middle of a swarm. She eventually gets the hang of it, hitting headshot after headshot. Lori and Glenn talk about the attack at the pharmacy and Lori apologizes because she thought the town was safe. Glenn gives Lori the morning after abortion pills she asked for, but also gives her prenatal vitamins that he found at the pharmacy. He urges her to let Rick help her make the choice and not make it for the both of them after confirming their friendship. Later, Andrea and Shane have sex while Lori takes the morning after pills. She immediately afterwards sticks her fingers down her throat to make herself vomit. After returning, Andrea apologizes to Carol and the two leave. Dale confronts Shane about the night Otis died and brings up Shane's attempt on Rick. Dale tells him it's time for him to leave because he knows who he really is, leading Shane to challenge Dale and threaten him. After returning to the tent, Rick finds the empty container of pills and goes to find Lori. The two argue about whether it is right to bring the baby into the world because of the risks, but Rick feels it's worth the risks. He asks if there are any more secrets and Lori reveals that she slept with Shane when she thought he was dead. He tells her he already knew. The end of episode 6. Everyone sits at the camp eating breakfast. Glenn looks over at the house, where Maggie stands shaking her head, then looking at Dale who nods. Glenn reveals to the survivors that Herschel's barn is full of walkers. The group immediately goes to investigate with Shane taking the lead. They discuss the situation and Shane insists that they leave for Fort Benning. Carol says her daughter is still out there and Shane tells her they need to consider the possibility that Sophia's dead. Daryl insists he's close to finding her, but this doesn't appease Shane. Rick says he's going to talk to Herschel about the barn and staying when Dale reveals that Herschel sees the walkers as sick people, and with good reason. This only makes Shane mad at Dale for not telling them sooner, but Dale thought they would be fine. The walkers in the barn start rocking the barn doors. The survivors know they will have to deal with this issue soon. Shane stands guard at the barn, testing the locks. Glenn goes to speak with Maggie, but she rebuffs him by smashing an egg in his hat. Carl and Lori discuss Sophia. Carl says that he doesn't want to leave the farm until they find Sophia, and even after that. Carol pursues Daryl into the stables and tells him not to go after Sophia because of his wounds and because she wouldn't be able to stand losing him too. Daryl, angered by this, storms out of the stable. At the RV, Dale loans Glenn his hat. Inside, Andrea is arming herself to go search for Sophia with Rick. Dale tries to warn Andrea about Shane, but she doesn't agree with him. After Andrea leaves, Dale asks Glenn to get some water. Dale gathers up all of the guns. As Herschel reads the Bible over lunch, Rick goes to him to discuss remaining at the farm again and to tell him that they know about the walkers in the barn. Rick just wants to talk, but Herschel demands that they leave before the end of the week and Rick confronts him about the reality that they'll face. He tells Herschel, who only saw the apocalypse via the news, about Hannah and asks Herschel to let them stay because his farm is their only safe haven. In a final attempt, he tells Herschel that the farm is special and that he needs to stay there because his wife is pregnant. As Rick leaves, Maggie and Herschel stare at one another in silence. Rick joins Shane at the barn and tells him that Lori is pregnant. Later, Herschel tries to justify sending the group away, stating that Carl doesn't need his help anymore. Maggie reminds Herschel of John 13:34, a verse he often quoted to her when Herschel decided to marry her mother about loving one another. Herschel asks if her feelings for Glenn are an issue, leading her to bring up the encounter with the walker in the pharmacy and Glenn saved her from people her father was trying to rescue. She asks him again to reconsider, saying that it is only about him and who he's going to be. Jimmy interrupts them to tell him that they've found 2 trapped walkers. Herschel decides to ask Rick, who is planning the search grid for Sophia, to come with him. Shane confronts Laurie about her pregnancy and tells her that he's sure the baby is his. He admits that when he saw Rick was alive, he wished that he wasn't because he doesn't believe Rick can survive in this world. Laurie tells him that the baby will never be his and belongs to her and Rick. As Laurie watches, Shane walks away and is stopped by Carl. Carl tells him that they have to find Sophia and that they have to stay at the farm. Laurie calls to Carl to get him away from Shane. Immediately, Shane goes to the RV to gather their guns, only to find them all missing. He asks Glenn where Dale has gone, but Glenn doesn't know. Shane goes after Dale, tracking him away from the camp. Deep in the swamps, Herschel, Jimmy, and Rick are walking through the forest with Herschel telling Rick about his neighbors. He tells him about a woman he knew who owned a nearby farm and an unknown person who Herschel met where he worked. As they free the trapped walkers, Herschel mentions Otis was the one that always corralled the walkers and put them in the barn. Herschel asks Rick if they'd be able to stop killing walkers, and Herschel explains his philosophy regarding the walkers. He tells him flat out that if they want to stay they will have to give up killing walkers and leave the barn alone. Meanwhile, elsewhere near the camp, Daryl and Carol are walking along a stream and Daryl points out a Cherokee rose among the creek bank. Daryl insists that Sophia is still out there and that he'll find her. Additionally, he tells her about how he feels ignored at the camp. Carol reassures him that they'll find her. Deeper in the swamps, the group tries to extricate the walkers that are stuck. Herschel explains that the walkers will follow them, they just have to keep hold of them. While on watch, Glenn spots Maggie walking alone and joins her. She ignores him, but he emphatically states that he had to tell the group. For a while he forgot the walkers are dangerous and secrets have a way of getting people killed. Glenn would rather Maggie be angry with him if it meant she was still alive. Maggie relents and they reconcile with a kiss. Elsewhere in the swamps, Dale is tracked down by Shane. Dale is in the process of hiding the guns from Shane when he is spotted. Shane confronts Dale and Dale asks if he'll kill him like he did Otis. Shane says he wouldn't waste his time as he's already dead. Demanding the guns again, Shane tells Dale the only way he'll stop him from taking the guns is if Dale shoots him with his rifle. Dale trains the gun on him, but can't pull the trigger. In the end he returns the guns, but says the world they're currently in is where Shane belongs. As Maggie offers to clean Glenn's hat, Shane returns to the farm and starts handing out guns to the group. Maggie, Carl, and Laurie try to talk him out of what he's planning to do. In the distance, T-Dog spots the group returning with the 2 captured walkers. Catching up with them, Shane argues with Herschel about his view regarding the walkers. Shane draws his gun and shoots the walker that was once Louise, saying that if it was a living human, it wouldn't be able to survive multiple shots to the chest and keep charging. Herschel, in shock, watches as Shane puts the walker down with a bullet to the head. Seconds later, Shane begins a tirade about how the group needs to start fighting to survive and that they need to stop wasting time on pointless endeavors like rescuing Sophia and keeping the walkers in the barn. Shane lets the walkers free from the barn and they begin to file out one at a time. Shane, Andrea, T-Dog, and Daryl kill them as the Green family watches in horror. Glenn only joins in with Maggie's consent. Rick doesn't try to stop them. Just as Dale arrives, a final walker's timid frame steps out of the barn and into the sunlight. The entire group is horrified to see that it is Sophia, still wearing her shoes and blue rainbow t-shirt, but her skin pale and her face in the snarl of a reanimated corpse. Carol runs forward in anguish, desperately screaming out her daughter's name, but is held back by Daryl. None of them can bring themselves to raise their weapon. Even Shane, who moments ago was in a furious rage over the group's inaction, is now frozen in a stunned silence. It is Rick who ultimately steps forward. Drawing his gun, he shoots her once in the head, having had the resolve to do what had to be done. The end of the 7th episode. Emotions run high after the barn massacre. Beth hurries over to the body of her mother, Annette, to mourn, but she is still alive and tries to grab Beth. Andrea saves Beth by driving a scythe through the zombified Annette's head. As the Green family walks back to the house, Shanika says Herschel of knowing Sophia's whereabouts, but Herschel denies knowing that she was in the barn, speculating that Otis had likely put her there before he died. He then angrily orders Rick's group to leave the farm. Rick ridicules Shane for his actions, but Shane mocks Rick's failed diplomacy with Herschel and criticizes his decision to continue the search for Sophia. Carl talks to Lori about Sophia, saying that he wanted to be the one to find her alive, but thinks that Rick did the right thing and that he would have done the same in his place. The survivors decide to bury Sophia, Herschel's wife, and his stepson Sean, and burn the rest of the bodies. Rick seems to be questioning his own leadership capabilities, admitting to Lori his frustration that he had everyone searching for Sophia when she had died long ago. Tensions worsen between Shane and Dale. Carol refuses to attend Sophia's funeral, which angers Daryl. Herschel packs his wife's possessions in cardboard boxes and digs out an old flask from his wardrobe, searching for the means to cope with the reality that there is no cure and he had been hanging on to a fool's hope. After the funeral, Andrea and T-Dog pile corpses into Otis's truck, saying that Shane did what needed to be done. Dale protests, suggesting that a new problem with Herschel was created in the wake of resolving the safety concern of the barn walkers. Maggie asks Glenn if he would stay if the rest of his group were to leave, but Glenn is unsure on how to answer. Beth suddenly grows ill and collapses. She suffers from a fever and other serious symptoms and seems to be in some state of shock. The group looks for Herschel to care for Beth, but discover that he has vanished, leaving behind his empty flask as a clue. At Maggie's suggestion, Rick decides to look for Herschel at the local bar and takes Glenn as backup. Shane is washing up at a water pump when Carol emerges from the forest, muddy and scratched. Shane cleans her cuts and apologizes for what had happened to Sophia. Meanwhile, Dale reveals to Lori that he believes Shane shot Otis and left him as bait to cover his escape, and that it's only a matter of time before he kills someone else. En route to town, Glenn confides to Rick that Maggie told him that she loved him. Rick says that they need more good things like that in their lives and that he should embrace those moments. Beth's condition creates concern, prompting Lori to send someone to search for Rick and Herschel. Daryl is the best choice, but he is still upset over the sacrifices he made in vain to collect Sophia and refuses to search for them. Lori decides to look for Rick herself, but while driving down the road, she accidentally hits a walker and crashes the car. At a bar in town, Rick discovers Herschel and tells him about Beth. Herschel reflects that he had robbed his daughters of a normal grieving process by giving them false hope and allowed himself to believe it too. Herschel also says that Rick must relate, saying he saw the same feeling wash over Rick's face when Sophia emerged from the barn, that there is no hope. Rick argues that nothing has really changed and people are counting on them to be strong, that it isn't about what they believe anymore, but about keeping their loved ones safe and giving them hope. This resonates with Herschel, who finishes his drink and decisively puts down his glass. They are interrupted when the bar door opens and two strange men walk in, giving their names as Dave and Tony. Dave says that they've come from Philadelphia and had tried to seek refuge in Washington, D.C., but the roads were blocked, so they kept heading west. He also reveals that they encountered a soldier from Fort Benning who told them the base was overrun. He mentions they may plan on heading to Nebraska due to its low populations and high gun rate. The five men converse cordially at first, but the strangers become increasingly impatient when Rick's group will not divulge information about the Green Farm. Tony begins barking threats, prompting Rick to jump to his feet with his hand on his gun. Seeing this, Dave tries to calm things down by laying his own gun on the bar and addressing Rick with a more reasonable tone. Dave tries to tell Rick he is desperate and needs a place to be safe, but Rick still refuses to divulge the farm's whereabouts, telling them it is full. He states that Nebraska is nice and they should go there instead. As Dave laughs at this remark, he reaches for his gun on the bar, but is promptly shot in the head by Rick. He then quickly pivots and shoots Tony twice in the chest before he can react, knocking him back against the wall. As he slides to the floor, Rick quickly strides across the room and, standing over Tony, executes him with a third bullet to the head. As the smoke clears, Herschel and Glenn stand alongside Rick, the gravity of what's just happened settling over them. At this time on the farm, Shane and the T-Dog are dumping the bodies of the slain walkers into a pile and burning them afterwards. Lori unconscious after a car accident. She regains consciousness just as a walker is forcing its head and arms through the cracked windshield of the car. Lori stabs it in the face and escapes. She is then set upon by another walker, which she kicks to the ground and hits across the head with a hubcap before shooting it. At the farm, the group is about to sit down to dinner and realize that Lori has disappeared. Daryl tells Carol that she had asked him to find Herschel, but he had refused. He speculates that Lori has gone on her own to town. Shane goes to find her, but when he arrives at the crash site, all he finds is the 2 walkers Lori has killed. He eventually finds Lori still heading into town despite her accident. To get her to return to the farm, Shane lies to Lori by saying that Rick has already returned. When they return to the farm, Lori finds out that Shane lied and she confronts him, but he defends himself to the group, saying he was only protecting the baby, revealing to everyone, including Carl, that Lori is pregnant. Meanwhile in town, after killing Dave and Tony, Rick, Herschel, and Glenn are about to leave the carriage bar, but instead get pinned down in the saloon by Dave and Tony's group. Rick tells them that Dave and Tony pulled their guns out on them first, and that it was just a regretful mistake everyone can just walk away from, but the group begins to shoot at them to avenge their friends. Rick tells Glenn to check the back exit. As Glenn walks down some creaky steps and approaches the door, a shadow outside reaches for the handle and begins to twist it, but Glenn shoots through the glass and scares him off. Rick tells Herschel to cover Glenn while he makes a run for the car. A man named Sean, who was part of the group, sneaks up behind Glenn and attempts to shoot him, but Herschel shoots and wounds Sean, who starts crying out in pain. Rick asks Herschel what happened. He says he thinks Glenn was hit. Rick finds Glenn is just frozen behind a dumpster. Walkers begin to devour Sean, and he is left for dead. When they head towards the car, they are shot at by Randall from the roof of a building across the street and retreat behind the dumpster again. A truck races up, and the driver, Nate, yells that walkers are heading their way and tells Randall to jump down from the roof. When he does this, he accidentally falls and impales his leg on a fence spike. Nate apologizes to him and leaves him to die, but Rick, Herschel, and Glenn argue about saving him and how to do so. Herschel suggests to put him down from misery. The walkers slowly begin to close in on them, so they decide to try to amputate his leg but do not have enough time. Before the walkers can devour Randall, Rick forces Randall's leg off of the spike, tearing his calf muscle and reducing Randall to tears. Back at the Green farm, Carol goes to check on Daryl, finding many dead squirrels and severed walker ears hanging on a clothesline. Daryl catches her and confronts her. After their argument, Daryl walks away from Carol, and she yells out that she will not let him push her away. In the farmhouse, Beth is still in a state of shock, not being able to react to anything. Maggie tells Andrea a story about Beth finding her birth control pills and how she lied to their father to keep her out of trouble. The next morning, the group starts getting ready to go into town to get Rick, Herschel, and Glenn. Dale tells Andrea that Shane is dangerous and that Shane doesn't want Rick or Herschel to come back so he can be leader, but Andrea doesn't believe him, claiming Shane has done more to keep this group alive than anyone, including Rick, and walks off. The car with Rick, Herschel, and Glenn returns to the farm with Randall blindfolded in the backseat as a hostage. The group argues on what to do with Randall. Rick says they will fix him up and then drop him off to fend for himself, but Shane thinks that he will tell his group where the farm is and this will start a war. Herschel reminds Shane that it is his farm and while he is there he needs to keep his mouth shut. Maggie pulls Glenn aside and asks him if anything is wrong. He explains how her father saved his life and that he froze and could not do anything to help. He had frozen because she told him that she loved him and he was afraid to die because of how it would affect her. She tries to embrace him, but he pushes her away. Outside, Shane and Andrea discuss what the group should do, while Lori tells Rick that Shane thinks the baby is his and that she thinks Shane killed Otis, that he is dangerous, and if Rick doesn't do something about it, they may all be in danger. The end of the 8th and 9th episodes. At the abandoned public works station, where Rick and Shane flee from attacking walkers, Shane barricades himself in a school bus as walkers bang against the door. Nearby, a bound Randall crawls toward a knife on the ground. Earlier, Rick and Shane drive down a country road. Rick stops the car short of their destination, 18 miles away from the farm, to confront Shane. Rick knows what happened with Otis, and he knows about Shane's affair with Lori. Rick asks Shane if he believes Rick is unable to keep his family safe. Shane counters he knows Lori's baby is his and will do anything to ensure they are safe. Rick opens the SUV to check on Randall, who's bound, gagged and blindfolded in the trunk. Meanwhile, at the farmhouse, Maggie confesses to Lori that Glenn lost confidence after the shootout at the bar. Lori advises that Glenn should man up and be stronger. Maggie attempts to leave to give Beth her lunch, but Lori insists that she'd do it instead. Back on the road, Rick makes plans for the coming winter, explaining that they have to conserve ammunition and stockpile food. Shane listens passively, staring out the window at a lone walker ambling through a field. At the farm, Lori brings Beth a tray of food. Rick drives past the 18-mile mark, looking to leave Randall somewhere he'll have a chance. He pulls up to a public works station surrounded by a fence. A walker in a police uniform approaches. Shane draws his gun, but Rick stops him. Rick cuts his finger and wipes blood on the fence. When the walker presses his face against it, Rick stabs it in the head and tells Shane that while it may be easy to use a gun, it is better to not use them. A second walker in uniform approaches, and Shane stabs it in the head. Later, Rick siphons gas as Shane examines the policemen's bodies, noting they haven't been bitten. Rick points to scratches that likely caused their transformation. Meanwhile, Lori collects Beth's lunch, which hasn't been touched. Down in the kitchen, as Lori clears Beth's tray, she notices the knife is missing. She confronts Beth, who pulls it from under the covers and hands it over. Rick and Shane drag Randall to the pavement. Rick drops a knife on the ground as he and Shane walk away. Randall begs them not to abandon him, trying to explain he's a normal guy and he even went to school with Maggie. Rick and Shane freeze and realize that this means Randall will know where the farm is. Shane prepares to execute him, but is tackled by Rick. He argues he needs time to think about what to do. Shane counters that Randall could lead his people to the farm and accuses Rick of putting Lori and Carl in danger by sparing Randall. The two begin brawling. Randall, meanwhile, crawls toward the knife. Shane topples a motorcycle onto Rick, briefly trapping him. He goes to Randall and aims his gun, but Rick gets out of the motorcycle and tackles Shane before he can fire. When Rick gains the upper hand, an enraged Shane grabs a wrench and hurls it at Rick. Rick dodges the wrench, but it goes through a building window which causes dozens of walkers to begin pouring out through the broken window. Shane flees the onslaught. A walker approaches Randall, who cuts himself free just in time to kill it. Rick empties his gun as walkers pile on top of him. At the farm, Maggie scolds Beth for considering suicide. Lori and Andrea listen in from the kitchen. Andrea tells Lori she shouldn't have taken the knife away and that Beth has the right to choose if she wants to live or not. Lori counters that Andrea got through her own death wish by shirking her chores. Andrea accuses Lori of taking her blessings for granted as she's had an affair with Shane, got reunited with Rick, and had Carl saved while others have suffered. Meanwhile, Beth tries to convince Maggie that they should kill themselves. Andrea enters the room, offering to watch Beth while Maggie gets some air. At the public works station, Shane barricades himself in a school bus against the walkers. Rick finds Randall and drags him to the SUV. From the school bus, Shane watches as his partner abandons him. Rick goes and takes the handguns off the two dead policemen. Unguarded, Beth locks herself in the bathroom and smashes the mirror. Lori pries open the door, but not before Beth has cut her wrist. In the bus, Shane is losing ground to the walkers when the SUV bursts through a nearby gate. As Randall drives, Rick leans out the window shooting walkers. Shane runs to the back of the bus and dives into the SUV. Andrea runs to the farmhouse after Beth's attempted suicide. Lori reports that Beth didn't cut herself deeply. Andrea takes it as Beth wanting to live, but Maggie disagrees in anger and tells Andrea never to set foot near her or the house again. Back on the road, Rick and Shane restrain Randall and toss him in the trunk. Alone, Rick admits he'll likely kill Randall, but he's still going to think it over. Rick tells Shane that if he wants to stay with them, he has to obey Rick as the leader as he returns Shane's gun to him. As Shane mulls over what he says, he stares out the window at a lone walker shambling through an overgrown field. In the farm slaughter shed, Daryl interrogates and beats up bound Randall. Randall confesses that he was traveling with a heavily armed group of 30. The men, he says, have raped women before. Still, Randall insists, "I ain't like that." Daryl reports back to the rest of the group. Rick declares Randall a threat and that he must be killed. "You can't just decide on your own to take someone's life," Dale objects, begging Rick to give him time to talk to the group and find another way. Rick agrees to give Dale the rest of the day. Dale asks Andrea to guard Randall against Shane while he talks to the others. He asks if Andrea agrees that Randall should be killed. "The world we knew is gone," Dale argues, "but keeping our humanity? That's a choice." Andrea agrees to watch Randall, "but not because I think you're right," she says. From inside the slaughter shed, Randall overhears Shane approaching with Carl. Carl is curious about the prisoner, but Shane insists he let the grown-ups handle it. Shane asks Andrea, who's standing guard outside, if she would stop him if he were to try to shoot Randall. She insists she would. Shane shares his suspicion that Rick won't be able to go through with the execution. Meanwhile, Carl watches Randall from the rafters of the slaughter shed. Randall notices him. "I didn't do nothing," Randall tells Carl, begging to be set free. Carl slowly starts walking toward Randall, but is halted when Shane enters. Shane shoves a gun in Randall's face and drags Carl out of the shed. "Quit trying to get yourself killed," Shane scolds. Dale approaches Daryl about Randall. "This group's broken," Daryl says, stating he doesn't care what happens either way. Dale asks Daryl to stand with him anyway, but Daryl won't. Lori finds Rick tying a noose in the barn. He asks if she supports his decision. "If you think it's best," she says, asking about what happened on the road with Shane. "He won't be a problem anymore," Rick answers. Carl is kneeling by Sophia's grave when Carol approaches. "They'll see Sophia in heaven," she tells him. Carl snaps back that heaven is just another lie, and if you believe it, you're an idiot. Later, Rick chastises Carl for talking back to Carol. Dale goes to Herschel, asking for his support. "I don't want to know," Herschel insists. "I leave it with Rick." Carl wanders into Daryl's camp and finds a handgun stashed in Daryl's motorcycle saddlebag. He pockets it and heads into the forest. Carl stumbles upon a walker stuck in the mud of a creek bed. Fascinated, he begins throwing rocks at the walker, then approaches to shoot it with Daryl's gun. The walker lunges at Carl, eventually freeing itself from the mud and grabbing onto Carl's leg. Carl falls to the ground but manages to get away. Dale, meanwhile, tries to convince Shane to spare Randall. Shane gives Dale credit for the effort and says that if Dale convinces the others, he'll go along with it. "But I'm telling you now," Shane warns, "you're wrong." In the farmhouse, Glenn finds Herschel checking up on Beth. Herschel asks Glenn about his family and tells him about his own Irish heritage. He hands Glenn a pocket watch that belonged to his grandfather. As the sun sets, Rick again asks Lori if she thinks he's doing the right thing. Lori nods. The group gathers in the house. Rick asks if anyone thinks Randall should be spared. Dale posits that the only people who think so are himself and Glenn, but Glenn too sides with Rick. "He's not one of us," Glenn offers. Dale begs to give Randall a chance to prove himself, but the others insist they wouldn't feel safe with him around camp. "If we do this," Dale says, "we're saying there's no hope." Dale pleads with the group to do what's right. Andrea eventually sides with him, but the others stay silent. Despondent, Dale leaves the room. "This group is broken," he says, echoing Daryl. Afterward, Rick, Shane, and Daryl bring Randall to the barn and put him on his knees. Rick asks if he has any final words. Randall cries, begging for his life. As Rick raises his gun, Carl enters the barn. "Do it, Dad," he says. Shocked, Rick lowers his gun and orders Randall taken away. Shane storms out of the barn. Rick brings Carl back to the camp and tells Lori what happened. He wanted to watch, Rick says. "I couldn't." Meanwhile, Dale walks through the fields. He hears the moans of a dying cow and goes to investigate. The cow had been gutted. He turns and is attacked by the same walker that Carl found in the creek bed. Back at camp, the others hear Dale's screams. Daryl runs to the scene, where the walker is on top of Dale, tearing into his stomach. Daryl stabs the walker in the head, then shouts for help. Dale is severely injured, his intestines have been exposed. He goes into shock. Rick and the group arrive at Dale's side and are devastated at Dale's injuries. When Herschel arrives, he reports that Dale can't be saved. As Dale writhes on the ground, Carl sees the body of the walker he was throwing rocks at previously lying nearby. Horrified, he buries his head in Laurie's lap. Andrea begs Rick to help Dale. Rick unholsters his gun, but since he had yet to shoot, an unarmed man not in self-defense can't bring himself to shoot. Daryl takes the weapon and aims it at Dale's head. Dale gives him a faint but reassuring smile before lighting his head up, giving him permission to end his torment. "Sorry, brother," Daryl says sadly and fires. The group holds a funeral for Dale. Afterwards, Rick announces that they are going to prove him wrong by showing the group can still work together. Herschel permits all but Shane to move into his house due to Shane's antagonistic behavior. Rick plans for himself and Daryl to bring Randall out to a nearby town and leave him there. Carl, feeling guilty about Dale's death, goes to Shane and tells him about how he knew of the walker and that he stole a pistol from Daryl's bike. Laurie tries to talk to Shane and apologizes for what she was doing to him, prompting him to tell Rick about Carl's confession. Rick declares his main concern is disposing of Randall, but talks to Carl and encourages him to keep hold of the gun, as they no longer can live without taking action. Shane goes into the barn and watches Randall, discovering that he was trying to slip out of his restraints. When Rick and Daryl prepare to leave, T-Dog is sent to get Randall. He discovers the barn empty. Shane has brought Randall into the forest, informing him that he is done with Rick's group and wants to join with the others. This is merely a ruse as Shane breaks Randall's neck, killing him, and strikes his own face into a tree to make it seem he was assaulted by Randall. A thorough search of the farm shows no sign of Randall. Shane buries his gun and shouts to the group that Randall escaped and is armed. Rick assembles Glenn and Daryl to go with him, and Shane to track him down. Glenn and Daryl come across where Randall was last seen, and the area shows signs of a struggle. A walker appears, and they take cover behind some trees. The walker is Randall and tries to attack them, but Glenn impales a machete into his head, killing him. An examination of the body showed no sign of bites or scratches, and that his cause of death was his neck being broken. Rick picks apart Shane's story and comes to the conclusion this was a ruse to lure him out into the field where Shane would kill him. Shane tells Rick he is a better father than he is and that him returning only messed things up. Rick makes it seem as though he's handing Shane his weapon, as he refused to raise his gun at him. Once his gun is in Shane's hand, Rick pulls out his knife and stabs him, saying that he had brought this on himself as Shane then dies. Realizing what he had done, Rick becomes distraught and sobs. As he tries to cope with what happened, Carl appears, shocked to see Shane dead. He apparently aims his gun at Rick, but is actually aiming at the reanimated Shane behind him. Carl pulls the trigger, killing Shane. Rick approaches Shane's body, weeping. As they examine Shane's body, they are unaware of the massive horde approaching on the horizon. The end of the 10th, 11th and 12th episodes. A herd of walkers roams out of Atlanta, attracted by a passing helicopter. The walkers continue down a country road, attracting more walkers along the way. In a field, two herds merge, and we watch as time passes and the herd grows, gathering more walkers. Eventually, a herd of thousands of walkers forms. The herd passes through a forest at night when a gunshot rings out. They change their course and follow the sound to a clearing where in the distance two figures, Rick and Carl, march toward the farmhouse. Daryl and Glenn return to the house and report that Randall is a walker. Herschel asks if they had found the walker that killed him, and Daryl points out that Randall was never bitten or scratched and that he had his neck broken instead. As Rick and Carl cross a field, Carl asks what happened to Shane. Before Rick can respond, he notices the walkers approaching and, with Carl following, begins to run toward the farmhouse, but the path up to the house becomes blocked by the herd. Rick decides to run toward the empty barn and locks himself and Carl within. As the dead slam against the doors, Rick douses the ground with gasoline and instructs Carl on what to do next. Meanwhile, the others spot the herd approaching. Lauren notices that Carl is missing and begins to panic. Daryl knows that they can't simply hide in the basement, as a herd of that size could tear the house down trying to reach them. The rest of the group formulate a plan to use their guns to kill as many as they can and use their cars to lead the rest of them away. Daryl doubts they'll be able to fend off a herd of that size, but Herschel stands firm. "This is my farm," he retorts. "I'll die here." Back in the barn, Rick hands Carl a lighter and sends him up to the hayloft before opening the doors. As walkers pour in, Rick hurries up the ladder and Carl drops the lighter. The barn bursts into flames. Led by Daryl's motorcycle, the caravan makes its way to the barn, shooting walkers as they go. A battle between the survivors and the undead breaks out. Glenn fends off many walkers using Shane's Mossberg shotgun and his car for travel, with Maggie in the driver's seat. Andrea also contributes, with T-Dog driving both in Otis's truck. Daryl, noticing the barn fire, assumes that either Rick or Shane is responsible. He sends Jimmy to rescue Rick in Dale's RV. Rick and Carl jump on the RV's rooftop as walkers surround the vehicle. In an attempt to escape the trapped vehicle, Jimmy is swarmed when walkers break inside and devour him. Rick and Carl quickly run into the woods, with walkers on their tail. Andrea and T-Dog realize the walkers cannot be corralled, and they don't have nearly enough ammo to finish them off. "We need a new game planned," T-Dog mutters. Meanwhile, Herschel stands in front of the farmhouse shooting walkers one by one as Lori continues to worry about Carl. Carol convinces Lori they have to leave. Lori calls after Herschel, but he ignores her and keeps firing valiantly. As the women flee, walkers grab Patricia, and she is bitten, while she holds on to a panicked Beth. Beth finally lets go of her hand and escapes with Lori as Patricia gets devoured by the walkers. Carol gets separated from the other two and is cornered. T-Dog pulls up and Lori and Beth get in, whilst Andrea gets out to help Carol, shooting two walkers before a third attacks her from behind. She spins around and fires. From the truck, Lori, Beth, and T-Dog see the walker fall on Andrea and assume her dead. Walkers swarm the truck and T-Dog drives away. Soon after, Andrea crawls out from under the dead walker, alive and uninjured. In Shane's SUV, Maggie and Glenn attempt to follow the truck but are cut off by walkers. Glenn instructs Maggie to retreat, but she's worried about the others. "It's lost." Glenn yells. "Get off the farm now." Maggie keeps protesting, but after a walker lands on their windshield, she panics and causes the car to lurch backwards before driving out of the farm. Back at the house, Herschel continues to fend off walkers. Running out of ammo, Herschel steps back to reload as a stray walker creeps up on him. Just before he is bitten by the walker, Rick arrives and kills it, imploring to Herschel that they have to go. Along with Carl, they drive off from a group of walkers swarming up on them. Andrea tries to call out for Rick, but the snarls of the walkers dwarf her cry for help as they begin to swarm her. She flees on foot with the bag of guns. The last to be on the farm is Daryl, who watches the barn conflagration from afar until he hears Carol's desperate screams. He drives to her aid, rescues Carol on his motorcycle, and they ride away. The barn continues to burn and eventually collapses. The RV is burned in the process. Herschel sadly takes one more look at his farm, now completely overrun, as they leave the property. At dawn, Glenn and Maggie are driving down a dirt road. Glenn instructs her to circle back to the highway, but Maggie is too paralyzed with fear. Glenn assures Maggie that her family will be fine. "I love you," he admits. "I should have said it a long time ago." Rick, Herschel and Carl return to the highway next to the car, where they left supplies for Sophia. Carl wants to go back for Lori, but Rick is hesitant. "Why are we running?" Carl screams at his father. Herschel assures Rick he's doing the right thing. "You've got to get your boy to safety," he says, offering to stay behind to wait for the others. Rick insists they remain together. Elsewhere, Lori insists that they head back to the highway, but T-Dog states that they should head east towards the coast. Lori threatens to leave the truck unless he turns around, and when she is close to actually doing so, he complies reluctantly. Rick is about to abandon the highway when he hears engines rumble in the distance, the other survivors' vehicles. After reuniting, Rick reports that Shane and Jimmy didn't make it. Lori is horrified by the news of Shane's death, but is glad that Carl is okay. Beth then reports Patricia's fate before Carol points out that Andrea might still be alive. Daryl prepares to find her when Rick stops him from leaving, saying there's no way to find her. Later, the other survivors caravan down a country road. Herschel's SUV runs out of gas and Rick declares they'll camp by the road and scavenge in the morning, but the others doubt him. "We found each other, against all odds," he insists. Rick does not allow anyone to leave and risk getting stranded without a car. Glenn counters that they're already stranded and, even worse, walkers are everywhere. Rick believes there's a place where they can build a new life. "We just have to find it," he maintains. Daryl brings up Randall, explaining that he turned without being bitten. "We are all infected," Rick murmurs loudly and solemnly. "At the CDC, Jenner told me. Whatever it is, we all carry it." The others become furious at Rick for keeping Jenner's secret, but Rick insists he had no way of knowing if it was true. Rick walks away from the group and Lori follows. "I killed him." Rick admits to Lori about Shane. "He gave me no choice. He says I wanted him dead," Rick says. "He turned. That's how I knew Jenner was right," Rick continues. "Carl put him down." Horrified, Lori backs away from Rick. He tries to touch her, but she backs away, looking at him with anger for allowing Carl to kill Shane. Andrea, meanwhile, sprints through the woods, picking off walkers, but eventually running out of ammunition. A walker topples her, but before it can bite her, its head is sliced off. As the walker's body slumps over, Andrea sees standing before her a hooded figure holding a katana and leading two Joles, an armless walkers chained at the neck with shackles. Huddled around a campfire, the others continue to question Rick's leadership. Carol tells Daryl he should lead the group as a man of honor. Rick has honor. Daryl insists. Maggie, too, tries to convince Glenn to abandon the others, but Herschel shuts her down. A noise echoes in the distance. Still, Rick refuses to let anyone investigate. Carol urges Rick to take action and he snaps, saying he never asked to be put in charge. "I killed my best friend for you people, for Christ's sake," he snaps at the group. Carl buries his head in Lori's shoulder, crying. Rick explains that Shane staged the incident with Randall so he could kill him. Shane gave him no choice. "Maybe you people are better off without me." Rick continues, encouraging them to leave him. "I say there's a place for us, but maybe it's another pipe dream." He dares them to leave, but none of them move, though they are all looking back at him in stunned silence. "No takers?" Rick asks. Then he issues a final warning: "If you're staying, this isn't a democracy anymore." Rick turns his back on the group. As the camera rises up above the trees, a large group of buildings is shown nearby in the dark, a prison. End of Season 2. As soon as this video gets 100 likes and 10 comments, I'm releasing a sequel.